Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Writer's Realm podcast, and thanks for joining us on the epic adventure we call writing. We're your hosts,
Holly Rebillard,
Austin Matthews,
and Bob Adato. And today we're going to be talking about writing sci-fi fantasy with Adam W. Schmitz. Hi, Adam.
Hey, nice to meet you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah,
welcome.
Nice to have you. Hey, so tell us what you're all about.
Yeah, so again, my name's Adam Schmitz. When I put my name on a book, I put my middle initial in there, so it's Adam W. Schmitz, but people still call me Adam Schmitz in reviews and social media here and there. But I write science fiction and fantasy, and I really, truly a mixture of the two. I know a lot of people just kind of mix the two on accident, but if you read my books, they really are intentionally a mashup of the two. So the way I sell it is a mix of Doctor Who and Game of Thrones. So the first series that I have out is called The Archives of Edgar Brave. The first book out is Alistair, followed by Spectres, that came out last year. And like I said, Doctor Who meets Game of Thrones. The main character is 15 years old, sees his brother spirited away through a wormhole behind his foster home and needs to jump in after him. And then on the other side of him, there is kind of a Game of Thrones style world on an alien planet, if you can sort of imagine that. Mm-hmm. And the magic system is really where the kind of that sci-fi element comes in, because it's more of like a Doctor Who style magic system. Mm-hmm. You're talking about like higher dimensions. If you're a fan of Carl Sagan, if you look up on YouTube, there's Flatland. If you look up that analogy, that's really kind of the essence of the magic system. You have characters called the Naeli that, if you could kind of think of if the Doctor from Doctor Who were kind of like a steampunk Jedi, then that's who the Naeli are. So you have that mixed in with the Game of Thrones world, and then you have this 15-year-old boy that is trying to find his brother, and then also trying to figure out how to get home. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Nice.
Yeah.
So this is YA sci-fi fantasy.
I would say. So I have a hard time placing it. I do say that it's YA, but the emotions do go all the way up to adults. So if you think of a lot of the kind of the YA topics, there's an adult spin to it. I do have children myself, and a lot of emotions go through my head as I'm observing them kind of going through their life milestones. And so I kind of look at it that way. So there's, for example, this unfortunately hasn't happened in my life, but long time ago. But if for example you have a parent die, my parents are both alive, by the way. But there's two ways to look at it. There's the child's take on it, and then the adult's take on it, the surviving parent. Like there's kind of the back and forth of like, what if we're talking about like 2 years after the death? Like, is it okay to move on? Is it okay to, like, what do you do as a parent?
Sure. And
so I have a hard time kind of nailing it down as just YA, just because the emotions go from all the way maybe about, like, the youngest reader I've had that's liked it has been about like maybe 12 years old, and the oldest has been, like 60s, 70s, that sort of thing.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, where can we find your books, and where can we find you?
So the books are on Amazon, and if you look me up on Instagram and Threads, my username is Adam W. Schmitz. Last name is SCHMITZ, and on Twitter I'm Schmitz Author, again SCHMITZ Author.
Okay, perfect. Wow, Flatlands. Is anybody else? I've never heard of this.
Oh no, it's great.
Oh, what is it?
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, so I encourage everybody. Carl Sagan does a great, amazing job of describing this analogy. But so I encourage everybody to just go look that after the podcast is over. Don't leave the podcast, but after the podcast is over, look it up on YouTube. So basically, what he describes is, what if we're not talking about this 3-dimensional space that we're in? What if we're talking about 2-dimensional space, something that's kind of easier for us to grasp, right? So what he says is, let's imagine a world called Flatland. everything is perfectly flat, not thin, flat. So you have a piece of paper, and every character on that is just a two-dimensional creature that is on that piece of paper. They can only move left and right, and when I say up and down, I mean like across the page, up and down, not vertically and up and down.
So this is like a scrolling dungeon crawler video game.
Yeah,
Yeah.
kind of like that. Yeah, actually,
Okay.
that's a great way to look at it. Kind of like if you're looking at a map for D&D, or on like Roll20, we're just talking about just
Okay.
the flat version of it.
Okay.
But if you kind of zoom in and think of their perspective, they have no concept of the guy outside the screen, or in the case of Carl Sagan's Flatland, the person above the paper. So he imagines, okay, what if I were to take this apple and I were to interact with this apple on this piece of paper? How would the people on the piece of paper in Flatland experience the apple? And I know that so Carl Sagan, if people's eyes are glazing over, go watch the YouTube. But basically, they would see the apple going into the Flatland as like bits and pieces. It would just look confusing as all get out,
Okay.
and it wouldn't look anything like you imagine. And so that's kind of the magic system that I try to capture in
Nice.
my books.
And I will say, if you look it up on YouTube, they do have like an animated version. It's great. So does a good job of explaining it.
Yeah.
For us
Yeah.
simple folk.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
there's one
so-
called Explaining the 10th Dimension, and it goes through all the way from Flatland and works it all the way up to the level 10 of dimensions too, which is a really cool way to
Oh,
look
I
at it.
like it. I'll have to look that up. That's cool. But yeah, it's amazing. I didn't do it justice. And I also don't want to glaze anybody's eyes over, but
No.
it's fantastic.
No, we get it. No, yeah. I just have never heard of it, so I love it. This is why we have other people, because we love hearing about experiences and what you guys are working on. So is this a series or trilogy, or how many books do we have?
Yeah, so it's a planned trilogy. I have the first two out. It's Alistair is the first book, and Spectres is the second. I have the third book ready to write this year, so it'll probably be out. It's maybe the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, something like that.
Nice.
Now, do you say planned trilogy as in it's planned out, or you're planning on it only being a trilogy, but there's a very good possibility when you get to the end of the book, it's just going to continue going?
It's going to keep on going. That's a great question. So the way I kind of look at it, and I have a few authors that I can name after this that love their books, but they just can't get that last book out. And so my plan is to finish out the trilogy, and anytime I get distracted, have that be a novella or an offshoot or something that's in universe, but it's tangential to this universe. So that way you can enter this universe through through this trilogy, or through one of the novellas, or one of the one-offs, something like that.
I like
and
that.
it is planned down. Sorry to cut you off. It is planned out to be 3, because there is, when you read it, there's a lot of storylines going off. So I do want to mention that everything does get tied out at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea of having like a novella or like a little bit of a spin-off, because I feel like it's so hard. Like we can't cram all of those storylines and all of those plots into just, a few books. And so I feel like we have all that information there. And a lot of the times it just sits off to the side while we start working on other projects. And it's so nice to have it there, because like you said, people can go back and kind of get their feet wet with a novella, or, look at some short stories or things like that are going to bring you into the world and help immerse you in the world without, having to commit to like a whole book right away. Or if they're trying to cleanse their palate from, different series or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, the crossover of all those kind of reminds me of like some Brandon Sanderson books where, if you read this one series over here, it'll be fine as it is. But if you have read these other books, you'll get these little winks, and you'll get these little Easter eggs. And so it'll be a nice little gift for people that have read the other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had this conversation with someone today, because we were talking about another series, and like there's like 7 books in this series, and then they have like a little novella. And if you read, there's characters in the main series that have already died. And so the characters in the series that are still alive have this strong emotional connection to these, dead characters. But as
Mhm.
readers, we've never met them, so we don't have those connections. So it's kind of confusing to us in a way, like why, we don't know them, we can't like them, so it doesn't feel as like impactful. But if you go and you read the novella and you actually get a chance to meet these characters before they die, when you go back and reread that series, it's so much more impactful because you've had those
Wow.
relationships, and those relationships weren't really necessary for the actual plot
Right.
of the whole series. But once you have that information about those characters, you're just like, oh wow, okay, now it makes sense to me why that character felt that way.
So did you read that the first way through with those pieces missing, and then you came back?
Yes, I did. And then I
Okay.
went back and I read the series again. And when I read the series again after reading those missing pieces, it was a completely different read for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Wow.
And I
Yeah,
think that's one of
completely
those cool
different.
things is like it gives you a way to make, have it have a rereadability,
Hmm.
that you wouldn't normally get. And it's like, oh, I can add layers of depth that change the context or change what it, you could even change what the actual meaning of something happening in a book is. So,
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, like adding adding different dimensions that completely change everything and turn it on its head.
yeah. Because, you could have a novella that you're like, oh, hey, like main story, you got the whole trilogy, good guys, you're following them the whole time, have a little novella, and you realize, oh, those have been the bad guys the whole time. And I don't get to see that until the novella.
That's written
Yeah.
really well. If you're thinking like that, that's a good author. Then.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It kind of reminds me of and this is big on the in media lately because the movie's out, but Wicked versus Wizard of Oz. How you watch the original Wizard of Oz and the main character's evil the whole time, and then in the Wicked retelling, she's it shows her side of things.
Yeah,
Mhm.
she's just green.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
She's got an
Exactly.
awesome laugh though in the other movie, the original movie. But
Oh yeah.
so when I'm thinking sci-fi fantasy, I
Yeah.
immediately think of George Lucas's Star Wars series. He said that was
Hmm.
not a science fiction; that was a fantasy set in space. So is that something that your books kind of follow, or what? How would you? I know you described it as a Doctor Who kind of a mashup, but
Hmm. I would say it's kind of similar to that, except in Star Wars, they use a ton of technology. So the kind of the trouble that I had really nailing down this genre and the cross section of the two is that I didn't want to do any sort of bait and switch on the reader. I didn't want to say
Mhm.
this is a science fiction and then they expect to see spaceships and laser blasts and then they pick up the book and there's no tech at all.
right.
So that's the problem is that I was kind of facing from a marketing perspective is that there is no tech in
Okay.
my series and there won't be.
Okay.
I do write tech and like my work in progress is a traditional science fiction, but the one I'm talking about that's out, there's no tech. The only reason why it's science fiction is because a lot of the early readers said that they got the feel they got from it was mostly science fiction and less so on the fantasy. But it was also that element of being on an alien planet and then the magic system being more science based
Mhm.
than a traditional fantasy fantasy book. I know there's a lot of fantasy books that have a magic system that have rules and they all make sense if you're in that world. But aside from the rules, having it have a theme of of physics and cosmology that really kind of sends the message home of like the science of the sci-fi.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You're a
Okay.
fantasy where science still matters.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's neat. I like that.
Yeah. I think that's something that I enjoy doing a lot is that like you think about, okay, you've got these fantasy worlds. So it's like take Middle Earth and you got, the little pieces of magic there. Well, what happens, 10,000 years from now when they have like our modern technology, but instead of using
Mhm.
like electricity, they're using these magic, like the Silmarils to power their world. And it's like, okay, is
Yeah.
it science fiction or is it fantasy at that point?
Right. Yeah. And even if you nail it down, what is the reader going to expect when they pick up the book, and how can you set the palette of that reader? And that's kind of where I kind of get not stuck, but like kind of the adventure behind it. Yeah, for me is making it so that when the reader picks up the book, there's no bait and switch. Like their palette is ready for what they're about to read.
Yeah, and that's something I'm really struggling right now because I'm writing something that leans a lot more on the science fiction side than I usually do. You know, people traveling around in a starship and everything, and I'm like, oh well, I have a big reveal like 2/3 of the way through the book that is very fantasy related. I'm like, I don't want people going into it thinking, oh, this is pure science fiction, and then like, oh man, magic came out of nowhere. So like, I have to make sure like really early on, like so prologue and everything is like, okay, we're getting into a lot of this because it ends up being Eldritch Horror at the end. So I'm like, okay, probably give some hints of that very elet.
There you go. Yeah, so you're not surprising them too much. Yeah, I like the prologue solution. But let me ask you before I kind of say this next part. I've heard there's some pushback in the writing community about like prologue versus anti-prologue. Or do any of you guys have an opinion?
I don't read prologues. That's just me.
You don't?
Maybe I'm.
Oh, you skip them?
I'm a jerk, probably.
Well, so here's the thing: is I don't think you should include anything in the prologue that people couldn't skip because people do skip prologues. But also, I would say that like for me, my prologues, whenever I do write them, are generally not necessary for the book, but they do add to the book. Kind of like we were talking about with the novellas. Like it's not necessary to have that other piece there, but it does add something to have it. And so like this, it's a lot of like tone setting, or it's like, hey, here's something that happened 300 years ago that's kind of relevant. It will be nice for you to know, but like you'll still get the full story without it. Because if you're using your main character and it's at the same time of the events, it should just be chapter 1. Like there's no point in it being a prologue. But if it's different character or a different time period, I think it makes sense to have it delineated that way.
Right.
So that's something, so you guys have read a little bit, the first few chapters of The Blood Sky, and what you're reading right now. So I have a 5 or 7 year gap in between the first, I think like after chapter 7, there's a gap. And so, spoiler guys. But I originally, what you're reading right now, all of the little bits of important information I originally had planned on having as a prologue, because I was like, I just want to start right at the meat and bones, start chapter 1 in the present time, like, working on the problems that we know are happening. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, I felt like I could get really, instead of just leaving it as a prologue that people are probably going to skip, they're probably going to miss a lot of the important things or like information about characters that are going to be relevant later. So I ended up actually just going back and just turning it into my first five or six chapters instead of a prologue, because I mean, I'll read a prologue, but I'm always like, I think that a lot of the prologues that I've seen are very much like something that happened like 7 million years ago that I don't feel like they're relevant to what I've read on the back of the book. And so I don't feel like it's really that huge of a, piece of information.
Yeah. So like my first book, the prologue happens, I think like 1200 years before chapter 1. And the thing is this the birth of magic in that kingdom. And so it's like, you get to see it, you get to see how dark and twisted it is because it sets the tone of like, hey, there's magic here, but it's not a cheerful thing. And like, so it's mostly there for tone as opposed to actual plot.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I kind of feel the same way. So that kind of the, like for my books, I ended up putting a prologue, but it's in the same kind of thing where it's just kind of, it's setting your palette for this world. Because my chapter 1, and I mentioned earlier that the main character is in a foster home and he sees his brother spirited away through a wormhole. So if you have that character introduction of the 15-year-old in a foster home and you describe the foster home, there's not a whole lot that's set in your palette for a science fiction fantasy. So I had a skippable to your point, Bob, about like a skippable prologue to just kind of say, hey, by the way, this is the tone that we're going for.
Well, I like that. I like the tone because I usually saw them as info dumps. here's this magic sword, and it was created. This is how it was created, and somebody hid it away, and blah blah blah. And then said, I turned the page, chapter 1. Somebody found the sword. Now, honestly, I would rather start with somebody found the sword and discovery later. Like, what the heck is this? A la the One Ring, from The Hobbit, which was just a plain old ring. It turned him invisible a couple times, and that's the end. And then we start off with Fellowship of the Ring, and all of a sudden, like, hey, this ring is huge, guys. Like, we need to destroy this. You know what I mean? Like, whoa, what the heck is going on? Like, I like that kind of discovery. Besides what I'm talking about. So if you're talking about tone, I feel like that resonates with like the emotional side of me as the reader, and I like that. I want to get ready for that. I want to see what this is all about. So something, but of course, how am I going to know unless I talk to you as the author and Austin, how would, oh no, this is about the tone of the book. Like, okay, I'll totally read that. But I really don't like when it's just a big information dump.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we as like, especially sci-fi fantasy authors have to keep in mind is like, we have to build trust with the audience that like, oh, if they read one of my prologues, and they're like, well, this was boring as all get out, they're never going to read another prologue from me. So it's like, I have to use that and know that like once they lose their trust on anything, it's going to be hard to get that back.
I think you can really use it to set your readers up for what they can expect through the rest of the story as well. Because to your point, and Adam, I'll use your book as an example. But if you have readers that are reading a mashup of, sci-fi and fantasy, and they're not sure what to expect, maybe that intro or that prologue can set them up, because if chapter 1 starts with him getting sucked up into a black hole, well, are those normal? Because it's a sci-fi, so maybe there's black holes all the time. We don't know. And so you can also, and I'm not saying this is what you did, but you can also use those prologues as an opportunity to just explore a little bit about what is actually normal, so that we know as readers when we go into it, like, oh, wow, okay, this is actually abnormal.
Yeah.
It might be a sci-fi, but people are getting sucked up into black holes all the time. So this is actually a problem. So it can kind of, like, you're right, set the tone, or kind of just give the readers a little bit of a taste of what they can expect and what they can rely on.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you made me think of, did you read V.E. Schwab? Yeah, V.E. Schwab at all?
Sounds familiar.
No. Okay, so I forgot the name of this book, but there's but she talks about it's this book where there's like all these different colors of London, and you have a magical jacket that you flip inside out a couple times, and then when you get the right flippage, then you can put the jacket on and go into red London or black London or white London. And it's a very cool world, and it's along the lines of what you're saying, where it's that's not the what's the literary term? That's not the part that like sells the story forward. That's just life, life in this world.
Okay.
Kind of cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, tangential question to your question. So we talked about how we feel about prologues. How do we feel about epilogues?
I live on them. All of my books have epilogues, and I read every single epilogue available.
Yeah.
Because it ties up all these, like, all your little loose ends. And what did we just saw something. My wife and I just watched a movie, and we're like, well, what happened to so-and-so? What happened to, and we're trying to figure out, like our last guest, we talked about the dog sitting, like she talked about a dog that was left in a car, and like, what the heck happened to the dog? Like, where's that? Like, so that's a fun little place to kind of, 5 years later or something like that. I like
5 years later, they found the dog.
It's fine. The dog is fine.
I'm sorry, the dog is
living
dead.
a good life.
Yeah.
You can't come back to a car 5 years later and hope the dog's
What's that cartoon? It's like an adult cartoon of the dog that was left out, and then the guy went into the future.
Oh, Futurama.
Futurama, yeah. And that poor dog is just kind of sitting there waiting for his owner, and his owner's like 3,000 years in the future.
Man.
Poor guy.
Such a good episode, though.
All right, what do you think about epilogues?
I am impartial, because I feel like I like things end like everything's kind of wrapped up. We've had like the climax, and then now we're at the end, and things are like tied up in either it's over or it is going to be another book. And so I like having that, like, everything's kind of tied up, but then you have the option of doing something else with it. However, one of my favorite young adult series is kind of tied up that way, where is the possibility for another book, but here we are, like, I don't know, 10 years later, and the author never wrote another book to kind of tie
Mhm.
up some of those smaller plot points. And so you're waiting and waiting, and it doesn't happen. And so I'm like, man, I wish there had been an epilogue because I would have loved to have had these couple questions answered.
See,
I think that's
Mm.
interesting, 'cause I've never thought about an epilogue as a way of tying things up. Like that's the part where I start to pick at, like, everything's nice and tied up at the very end of the last chapter, and then epilogue, I go, but what about this thread over here? And then I pull
Yeah.
that thread.
Yeah.
or even better, like my books are like everything's tied up, case is solved, and then I go, or is it? And like dun dun dun, something, a hand is coming up at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like for
Like
me, it's
the
like I do
dead
a lot of
enemy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
I was just gonna say I do a lot of like the cross series stuff, and so like the epilogues and the prologues tend to be where I bring that in, like into the forefront. It's like, okay, this isn't the main plot, but like, hey, this person is now in here. Like, oh, like there's a conversation between this main character that was through the whole thing, and this other character from a whole different series. So you're like, that's not a person from this world or whatever. And so it's like you get those tastes of like bigger plot going on in those moments.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think for me, I haven't really had a need for an epilogue. Most of the time, when I think of something that would go in the epilogue, I would just have that be the last chapter.
Mhm.
When you were thinking about like whether or not the epilogue is skippable, I'm thinking of this one. I'm going to leave out the name of the book just because I'm about to spoil everything. But it's a book about this married couple and kind of the back and forth that they have. And in the epilogue, they reveal that, surprise, surprise, they're serial killers.
Nice.
And so if you picked up book 2 and you just like, oh, like, wait, what's going on? Why are these guys serial killers? And you'd be completely thrown off if you didn't read the epilogue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't.
Don't skip that part.
Yeah, don't skip that part. So I haven't had a need for it. Whereas for, like I was saying earlier, for the prologue, I like it to use it for tone setting. I haven't had a chance where I've been like, this story needs an epilogue yet.
Nice. So you're talking about how you wanted to make sure you didn't do a bait and switch with the readers while you're writing this. So without naming, because we don't want to trash any other books or authors, but because then we would have to be included because we don't know what we're doing either. But have you ever read a book like that and you said, man, if I'm writing a book, it's not going to be like, I'll remember not to do this kind of thing, where it caused such a visceral reaction in you, to like, oh my God, I'm going to throw the book across the room.
No, I can't say I have. Most of the time when I've read something or seen it on TV, and they did something that was completely like, where did that come from? The only time that it's been a bait and switch for me when it was like a low budget movie or something, or a low budget TV show where they just did not have the funds and they just completely like surprised you out of nowhere. Right. And it's like, okay, these guys don't care. And so I think it was more that I was worried about doing a bait and switch more than I've seen a bad example of it. Because I'm thinking about the examples that I have seen, and I thought it was cool.
Skywalker.
Yeah.
Rise of Skywalker was like
oh yes.
where we got surprised and we're like, what the heck just happened here?
Yeah.
Okay.
These directors didn't talk to each other.
They had a lot of money. Anyway,
right.
There's my rant. So
there's your hot take. Yeah. Yeah. So that's mostly I've mostly only seen it in film when they didn't have a whole lot of money behind it. It's tough with books. I haven't seen it just because writers tend to love what they do and they don't really do it for the money, or they don't really need a whole lot of.
That's a great point.
A lot of money to write it on a page.
Well, and I think that comes down to something too that we were talking about. Is like it's that promise of tone at the beginning of it, or even the marketing of what genre you're in. Like I think it was Dan Wells that was talking about. Well, he's got a book thing that's being marketed as like a thriller or a mystery novel, but like he's a horror writer, and so whenever it turns out that the murderer is a demon at the end, it's kind of a big deal and throws a lot of people off. He's like, I'm a horror writer. What'd you expect? But if you don't know he's a
Oh.
horror writer, like, you know,
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you this, and let me check. I think is Shawshank Redemption written by Stephen King?
Yeah, it was
Okay,
called.
so-
It had a different name. It's a short story.
Okay, so
yeah.
let me ask you this as kind of as a rebuttal. If you were reading Shawshank Redemption and there was an evil demon clown that came out from one of the cells, would that be a bait and switch?
it depends how far into the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, and I don't know. It wouldn't be in a good way, right?
Yeah.
I don't think.
I mean,
it would,
we
yeah,
are talking
I'd
about
be
Stephen
ticked
King,
off.
so he would have
Yeah.
done a good job. Whatever he would have done, he would have done
True.
a good job with
Well,
it.
yeah, and I think that's the thing is that, like, it only feels like a bait and switch if it's done poorly.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Because,
Good
like,
point.
I feel like part of the bait and switch problem is that, like, you've got all these clues that are leading to one destination and none that are leading to the other one, but the other one's where you end up. Whereas, like, with a twist, you've got clues all the way along where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
we're heading to A, but then
Right.
once I know we're going to B, I can look back and go, there was clues the whole time. I was just blind to it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what. Yeah, I think that's what makes it a better story. Like
Mhm.
in the Sixth Sense, right? Like in a rewatch, you're like, oh crap! Like I should have known that guy was. Oh, spoiler alert, dead all the time. But,
I
there's
think-
all
I think that's the
these-
most spoiled movie of all time. So I don't think
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, man, there's some new kids that are watching and go, what the heck is this movie? I don't have to watch it.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. I know what you mean. It's like that thing where, if done well, and going back to what the execution is, if done well, then placing those little foreshadowing moments throughout the book, nobody would pick them up because they didn't know to look for them until they were right in front of it.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing is it's not like you have to plan those out. If you get to the end, you're like, man, I feel like I kind of baited and switched. It's like, well, let me just go add a bunch of clues throughout the
There
book.
you
go. Yeah, there you
go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's that's one good thing about being an author is going to rewrite.
Yeah.
Bob, you mentioned being in D&D, being in D&D. Are all you? Do all you guys play?
I do, yeah.
I
Yeah?
do not. I've never played, but I have friends that still to this day are like, you need to come with us because you will
Hey,
You would have
become
a
an
great
addict.
Fix that when we go to a
Yeah.
conference. So.
Well, I was thinking, like, if you're writing a book, then it's easy to go back as long as you haven't published it, or at least as long as you're not like switching things out on book like 2 or 3, then you could just go back and kind of add in those little changes, whether it's foreshadowing changes or something else. Then you could do that. But I can imagine with D&D, if I don't know if any of you guys have been a dungeon master, but I imagine it's probably harder to go back and rewrite things if you do one session at a time.
Yeah, well, I definitely am a pantser even as a DM, but one of the nice things is like I just say a bunch of stuff and then like occasionally take notes. I'm like, I can probably pull this into something later and pretend it was planned the entire time.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you have to think on your feet as a DM because like you have 4 or 5 people that come up with their own ideas, and the DM's like, okay, we were actually supposed to go in the hall, but do you want to go underneath the hall? Okay, so you have to figure something out. Like, all right, we're going to do that instead, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I planned on all this, but
Exactly.
now you're going down this other hallway, so
Right.
I guess I'll have to pants this. Yeah. So are all you guys pantsers or plotters? You're a pantser?
I'm a combination of both. I do both.
He's a
Pretty
planter.
split. I'm a planter.
Planter.
Pretty much right down the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've just gotten really loose with my pantsing. So like I have gotten to the point where I can pretend I'm pantsing a novel, but I'm really just writing an outline. So it's just like the barest bone. It's like 10,000 word rough draft. And I'm like, okay, cool. It's just a really, really good outline.
Yeah.
Nice.
Instead of a really bad first draft.
Yeah, there you go.
How about you, Adam?
So I would say I'm a combination of the two. But to get like specifically, and this is part of my kind of background. But by trade, I'm a software engineer, and so kind of the way I think of things is to kind of plan the big picture and then go smaller and smaller and smaller and more detailed as I go in. And so the way that the way that I plan out my stories is to first come up with an outline, and then from there I kind of keep it loose. So each when I put together my outline, I say just what the goal of each scene is, and also what the POV of the scene if you have multiple POVs. And then once I get into that scene, then I pants it for about like 1,000 to 2,000 words, and it could go in every which way. And then that also allows some of my favorite books are the ones that are led by the characters, not the plot. And so it kind of lets me follow the character. And if the character is going to screw everything up, then I'll let them do that. And then if it's an outline form, then it's a lot cheaper, quote unquote, cheaper on my time to kind of change things when they're in outline form.
Yeah. And like, that's the thing is like, whenever I'm going through and like looking back at it and like, okay, I look at my outline, I'm like, oh, hey, I need to add a chapter where it's like, I need to make this character more sympathetic. And so like, that'll be my outline. It's like, okay, I'll pants it once I'm there, but I'm like, okay, I need this thing to happen. I don't know what that thing is yet, but I'm going to make them sympathetic in this chapter or whatever it is.
Yeah. That's cool. So then the thing that you need, you can either, if it's in the past, then you can go put it back there. Or if it's in the future, you can just add it to the outline.
Yeah.
Nice. Great.
I know a really great author who she had something similar. She had planned out, she had been planning this novel for years, but she had planned out a relationship between two characters. And as she got writing, she made it like part of the way through and realized that the two characters that she had intended on having a relationship, the way that their characters had developed as she was writing, they would never actually have a relationship with each other. And so she ended up having to throw that entire section, like that whole, and that was like one of the main plots. And she ended up having to chuck it all out and reframe it to have one of the characters form a relationship with another person that they were better suited for it to actually work with the story. And so I always think about that now when I'm writing. I'm like, I've had characters that just do whatever they want. Like they're not following the direction at all. And it's so amazing. And that's, I think, one of the great things about being an author is that you can have that flexibility and let them do that.
Yeah. And when they get themselves killed, it's their own fault.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I know what you mean. And almost kind of like, and there's another way, as you were describing that, I was thinking, there's another way they could have done if these two people that you're really trying to get together, if they just don't work out, that could be your new plot. And then you could have like either the ending be that they just don't work together, or you could interlace another background character that one of them is closer with, and then they end up going off with that character. So it's more of like a love triangle, or maybe like a hidden love triangle because nobody's saying it out loud kind of thing. So you could kind of follow the character in that regard as well.
Ooh.
Absolutely.
Hey, is there any romance in your books, Adam?
So no, for this series, but I learned my lesson because a lot of people asked for it when I was at book fairs. So the work in progress that I have right now is that has more romance, but they're still like kids. So it's like kind of like oh my gosh, I held her hand kind of thing. Like it's all
Nice.
It's still like kind of YA love, but that one's more of that one has the romance, but still like kind of coming of age romance, rated PG.
Okay, no, that's nice. Yeah, that'll be good. I think that's a healthy. How can there not be any semblance of romance, right? Like when we're writing a book. My first one, I regret not having anything in there because it was like I just wanted to get into all the action. Like I don't have any time for romance. And then I was just like, God, this isn't like human. Like they have to. There has to be another interest somewhere,
I will amend what I just said. In the second book, Inspectors, there is a little bit of romance. One of the things, and I was talking about, I don't want to ruin anything, but there is a little bit of romance in Inspectors. Nice. So and actually now that I'm saying it out loud, it's like a big part of the plot. So I don't know what I was talking about.
When I first started writing, I didn't do a whole lot of romance, but then it's funny because like as I've been doing more and more, it's like this is actually really fun. And my favorite relationship that I've been writing is in that sci-fi. There's only two characters pretty much in the entire book, and it's the pilot and the computer, and like that's the budding romance between them.
Oh,
And it's like a grumpy sunshine, like, oh man, the computer's like a real prick at the very beginning.
so
So it's like trying to romance Hal.
Yeah.
like an enemies to lovers. Like if they're just like they hate each other, but it's
That's
also
funny.
it's also like the computer's like an AI. Is that what it
Yeah.
is?
Yeah. So it's, but it's like it's one of those things where it's like, is it really sentient? No, probably not. But it's just like when you've spent nothing but like the last 20 years or whatever it is on this ship with nobody but a computer, like you know, it happens.
So this is like
Yeah.
Google Maps if I'm driving out to Milwaukee from California or
Well,
something. and
they're a
you
little
tell
bit
me
more
to make a left.
snarky.
That's funny. So the way you're saying it, I'm almost picturing. I'm thinking less of like a serious, like the movie Her. I think it was called Her.
Mhm.
And then but the way you're describing it feels more like a Douglas Adams kind of Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah,
Like funny.
It starts out like pretty comical, like because it's like, you know, the traditional romantic comedy of like, oh man, they're really butting heads, but then it's like, oh, they start to like each other, and like in the end, there's like a really sweet sacrificial moment between for the two of them. So it's like, hey, you know,
Yeah.
That's
full
cool.
circle.
But meanwhile, the computer's not sentient. It's a like a Google Maps.
Yeah, it's just
That's
like
funny. That's funny.
algorithm-driven.
I like that. That's creative.
So a little bit of romance, and you've got magic.
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about the tropes with the sci-fi fantasy.
Yeah. So a few other tropes that are in there. There's a little bit of the like a chosen one trope. So if you think so one thing that you're kind of clued into in the beginning, there's a song that the foster father sings, and it kind of hints that it hints that the foster father might know more than he leads on about the kind of the greater story. But the words of the song kind of clue you in that the story that we're going through has happened before. Not in another book,
Yeah.
but like happened before in this universe, and and they're tripping over things again for the umpteenth time, and so then the main character Edgar Brave is trying to figure out what role he plays in that, because there's a lot of people that just come up to him and kind of give him little hints and clues that he's pretty dang important, but he doesn't know what they're talking about at all.
Yeah.
And
So it's kind of reluctant hero a little bit.
yeah, kind of a reluctant hero.
Nice.
Reluctant hero turns to chosen one kind of thing. And I think I had the tropes written down a few times, but I'd say that's kind of the big one.
Yeah. Nice.
So a lot of messing with the concept of time in that.
Yeah, but it's not time travel.
No,
It's just more like they just keep being interrupted, or they interrupt it, or
like dilation.
Yeah, more like time dilation. So if you think about like, and I try not to go too much into the science in it, because I want people to kind of escape, and I want everybody to be able to read it, not just the people that are really, really like fine tuned to the science. But you could think of it more of like a kind of like a time loop that they're essentially trying to get out of. It's the prologue that Bob would have skipped is
clueless Bob.
Yeah. So they're in the prologue, and it's only like 500 words, so I won't ruin anything. But basically, it's kind of the end of times, and then there's this clue in that that things are starting fresh. The garden's coming back, and refreshing everything anew, and then it goes into chapter 1 where you meet Edgar. So so there's this kind of idea of this time loop going on, and what is everyone's role in that.
Nice. Okay. So I feel like that's the science fiction part, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, that may be in a fantasy book somewhere, but I haven't really. I mean, I've heard of that, but not necessarily in a fantasy book. So
right.
I
So
feel like that's where it's different.
It is largely science fiction. The part where it's fantasy is, which I don't think I've talked too much about in this podcast, but the part that's fantasy is really the war and politics that are going on the alien planet. There, like I mentioned, that there's no tech on this planet. It's all like Game of Thrones tone. You know, like this country is trying to. This territory is trying to invade this other territory, and they can't do it because they don't have big enough of an army. So they do it a strategic way, and there's this element of good and evil, swords, and doing that kind of Game of Thrones style battles. There's kings and queens and ascensions to a throne, that sort of thing. But all that's going on with the backdrop of the science fiction stuff that I just mentioned.
Nice. Wow, that is a really good balance, I think. That's like a perfect, that's a perfect blend, right? Like because when I read that science fiction fantasy, I was like, well, what the heck does this mean? I don't, and that's why I went immediately to Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, like I think there's some like good ones that kind of skirt that line too, like thinking of like Dune, where it's like, is it science fiction? Is it fantasy? What is spice? Is spice a fantastic thing that just like, I mean, it makes them see into the future? That feels fantasy, but also it's like everything about it being on, the planet of,
Dune is a good blend. I have seen some people describe even the magic system of Dune, which seems more fantasy. But I have seen people describe that magic system in a science fiction-y way. It's really interesting. The people that are like really know a lot more than what I do, they've talked about. They've described it's really amazing. I'm not going to do it justice, so I won't even try. But I've seen them describe it in a science fiction way. But yeah, I agree. It's kind of like there's not a whole lot of tech in Dune except for the spaceships that they use to get from place to place. So, pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I like it.
So what do you all write? Bob, I've seen your kind of like steampunk books at the.
My crap. Let's other.
No, it's not crap. It looks great. It was funny when we were at. So just to set the stage for people that are listening, we were at a book fair, and I was talking to a bunch of readers right next to Bob's table, and I kept on seeing them just kind of like eye his covers while he's off in the bathroom. And I'm like, he'll be right back.
I think I was eating donuts all the time. They had like these awesome, a table full of donuts. It was just like,
I love donuts.
I know, it was insane. And I'm like, are these free? And they're like, oh yeah, they're free. I'm like, oh my gosh. I must have come back with like 4 of them or something.
I went and picked up those donuts actually. So
you picked them up.
Yeah. So funny story.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I didn't pay for them. I literally picked them up. What the funny story is my wife's high school math teacher, English teacher. It they called her Miss Ross, but she's Tanya Ross. She's an author, by the way. Go look her up, Tanya Ross. But she put together the book fair. And she was, again, my wife's English teacher when my wife was in high school. And now, we're all adults. And my wife's talking about my book on Facebook. She's Facebook friends with her old teacher. And she's like, oh, well, why don't we get in touch? Why don't we get in touch and then he can help me put on this book fair? And so I didn't do a whole lot to put it on. I just picked up the donuts.
No, you're the hero. You made me so happy. I think I ate more donuts than I had sales there.
Yeah.
What does Holly write? Holly has a book called Heartbound.
I do. It's a fantasy novel. Little bit more. I don't want to say it's heavy on the romance. I mean, it's romance, but it's I don't know that I would say it's romantasy because the plot isn't like a romance plot. It's just kind of a subplot. So fantasy.
Okay. So when you advertise it, the niche you go for isn't romantasy. The niche you go for is more of like the fantasy and then a few tropes.
Yeah, I do it a little bit as a romantasy, because that's kind of more what the book is geared towards, or the people that would read it, I guess. I kind of threw it out to a bunch of my friends that I know read, and they were all like, "Oh yeah, romantasy, romantasy, romantasy."
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably they're a little bit partial to those, and so they pick up more on that like romance plot, and they kind of live for that. So to them, it's an easy romantasy read.
Mm.
Whereas somebody else might have focused more on the fantasy elements and the like the magic system and the world building and stuff like that that went with it. So I kind of do it both ways, but usually when I'm talking to people that I know read romantasy, that's just how I pitch it to them.
Gotcha. Okay. That's great.
Huh. While you were saying that, because I was picturing all like the romantasy tropes, and I'm like, you know what? I kind of want more of in my romance or in my fantasy like novels. I want like mature role model relationships because I don't feel like there's a whole lot of those.
Well, that was kind of
Yeah.
like what we had talked about last week. And I swear, since I said this out loud, I have seen it nonstop. And so now I've started writing another book, because I'm determined to never finish my trilogy, apparently.
Yeah,
But
I get it.
a lot of the romance plots that we see in fantasy right now, at least from a female's perspective, are these younger female characters. And they're always like, maybe at the oldest I think I've seen lately is with the popular ones is like 25 or 26 years old. And
Yeah.
so they're very popular books though, and so everyone's reading them, but now everyone's kind of like, okay, so we've got all these popular books, all these different series that have come in, and it's always these women that are under 25, and everyone that's mid 30s or 40s, they're like, it's great to read, but I can't really relate to this.
Yeah.
And
Different milestones, different life
yeah,
experiences.
and so I've been seeing it all over the place. People are like, "Where are these 35-year-old main characters?" Like, that's what I want to see. Like, I want you to come home at the end of the day and be exhausted. Not, you just battled, 10 freaking dragons and you came home and you're like, "All right, let's make dinner." Like, and it's just, I think people are kind of starting to, they still love those stories, but there's this weird emergence coming now, I think,
Yeah.
where, we're kind of starting to see like a little bit of a shift and people being interested in things that are still fantasy, but they can actually relate to with their age. So
Wow,
Maybe that's why
really?
cozy fantasy is becoming such a
Yeah.
thing. It's like,
Yeah.
I was
I'm
gonna
so
say.
tired. I'm just going to open a coffee shop.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly what I was thinking because I just wrote a very short story by like 10,000 words, short story, cozy fantasy, and it's an older wizard. Like he's coming back from the wars and he's tired and his knees hurt, and it was very relatable. And I'm just thinking also it could be a subgenre of fantasy, relatable fantasy.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's I wonder if like on I don't know, have you looked on I guess it would be Bookstagram or Book Talk for like they have a subgenre kind of carved out. It sounds like there would be a lot of readers like that, especially like when I'm on Book Talk or Bookstagram, it seems like a lot of the folks are around my age, like above 35.
Yeah. And I think people thought there was that weird emergence of new adult, I think they call it. I think that's what it is. There's like young adult and then there's adult, and they're like, okay, new adult's supposed to be the middle, which is like, 18 to like 24. But I think that
late adult.
yeah, right.
LA
Yeah.
fantasy.
And I just feel like even though so I think there's this weird stigma about like an adult fantasy because people think that it's just going to either be like very graphic or it's going to be very aged, and it's for some reason they associate adult with not as exciting, and so there's like, oh, it's a new adult book, so it's like college age, and I'm like, that's great, but like I can't relate to that. I haven't been in college in years.
Yeah.
But people don't want to read the adult ones.
And it's almost like we don't want to. Like we were done with that. Like we made a lot of mistakes. We don't want to. I don't want to relive that. Like I'm sorry to say, that's why I'm not reading YA because I don't want to be a teenager again.
Yeah,
That's just me. but we
Yeah.
want to be some guy who makes money.
Yeah. Well, and like any of the YAs that I read and that I really, really enjoy, they mention the character's age as like, 18 or 19 or whatever, but then they never mention it again. And all of the characters' emotions and actions and things like that are much, much older. And so I think that's also important to keep in mind with fantasy or sci-fi is that with these different worlds that we create, people are experiencing different things. Their daily life is not our daily life. So it might be a younger character, but they can be experiencing much older emotions, and that's
Yeah.
okay because that's the world that they live in. So I think it's
Right.
just, being able to find and kind of get through some of the weeds and just find the even if it's not necessarily geared to your age, but just the characters really reflect you can be difficult sometimes, I think.
Well, it makes me think about kind of like when you're like I heard someone talking about recently about, and I'm not going off topic. This is related, even though it won't sound like it. But I had heard someone talking about why it's so hard for adults to make friends as compared to when you were younger, when you were in school. And what their take on it was that when you're going through school, everybody's hitting the same milestones at the exact same time. Everybody's synced up in that regard, and they also have something that they're looking forward to. And then once you're like out of college, out of school in general, even if you don't go to college, if you're just out in the world, then the people that you sync up with, they're all different ages, they're all going through different milestones, and the thing that they're looking forward to isn't always the same. So everybody's just completely in different directions. And so if you could think about, coming back to the topic we're talking about, we've been talking about it as like cozy fantasy and or cozy whatever, cozy romance, cozy whatever. But if you were to branch out of cozy and you had to have something that was pushing you forward and excelling the plot forward to where you were really excited about it, it would have to be something that we're all experiencing, but we're all experiencing at age like 35, 36, 40, 45, something like that. And so I could see there being kind of like a nice little twist there that you would need to really nail down. I have seen it done in, have you guys seen the show Bad Sisters? Actually, I guess there are a lot of examples of that, but I think it's on Apple. It's either on Apple TV or Hulu, but they're all like kind of older, like in their like not older, but they're in their like 40s and 50s, and just they have these things that kind of push them forward. Although they're not relatable because the topic is murder. So
how fun!
Yeah. Well, I mean, like thinking about it, it's like even the first book I ever read in the Discworld series is like somebody just going on tour, like he's going on like a vacation. It's like somebody who's like saved up money, so it's like very like our age, where it's like, oh, I'm living in a fantasy world. I work a normal job, and I'm just going to go on a tour and like happen to see all this fantastic stuff. So
yeah.
But then too, it just makes me think of like when you see all of the like the hero's journey. It's like all these kids that are going off to save the world. Like, what are their parents doing? Like, I want that story. Like, you just let your kid go off and do this. Like,
Yeah.
Like,
I think that's why all those Disney
solving all the problems.
Yeah, that's why all the Disney movies have to kill off the parents in the beginning because like why else would the kid be gone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be interesting seeing the Goonies parents like have their own movie. Like, what the heck?
Oh yeah, there you go.
Kids?
I think you just started a retelling. Somebody's got to retell the Goonies from the parents' perspective.
That's mine. That's mine. I just trademarked it right now. I just trademarked it. All right. Well, it's time for our segment of Don't Do This. Now, I will warn our listeners that we are preparing to change this up as the last segment. It's no longer going to be always Don't Do This. We're going to add some other stuff. But we don't know
my
yet.
don't is going to be don't change it.
All right. Austin says don't change it. There you go. And he's spoken, and that's it. We're going to mute him from now on. But no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so just FYI, listeners. Let me see. Hey, we had just real quick for everybody. I was checking our Podbean and like who's listening from where around the world. We had our first listener from Asia. I'm pretty sure it was China. Yeah, so I don't know. I just thought that was fun. Hello to China if you're listening. But of course they are because they have our phones. But anyway, We're moving on. Okay, so don't do this when writing sci-fi fantasy. What should we talk about? Don't do this. This is always a tough one for us.
So I have an idea,
Yes.
but I'm curious your thought because a lot of times it's unavoidable. But so with science fiction fantasy, I really like the world building part of it, and a lot of times when you pick up particularly fantasy books, they're very thick, and that's not the don't do. But the don't do is the is info dumps. So like I feel like a lot of times they're unavoidable, but you should be able. This is where the I hate to sound like a cliche about it, but show don't tell. Like you should be able to show don't tell your world. So if you're talking about something and you find yourself really getting into the info dump, particularly if it's in dialogue, like I think the early kind of Star Wars scripts that had a lot of info dumps in the dialogue, and it just sounded kind of corny, and and so what I would prefer better is if you had like something that was more show don't tell, where you take them, even if it particularly fantasy readers enjoy that kind of ride where you take them and you're immersed in the world a little bit more, rather than having one person kind of describe it. So what are your thoughts on that?
100%.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely.
So
It's lazy
comfortable-
writing, honestly.
Yeah, I'm totally comfortable with readers being in the dark about world building if it's not relevant. Like, because if I can't show it, then that means it wasn't relevant. Like,
That's a good point.
Mhm.
I mean,
I
sometimes
do that.
Oh, sorry.
No, you started. You go first.
I'm so sorry. I was just gonna say, yeah. Sometimes as readers, we like that. Like, not a whole lot is known about them. Real quick, it was I just finished reading this series, and I can't remember the author's name or the book series name. Darn it! But in the very first few paragraphs, he mentions a creature called a flathead. Gosh, I can't remember the name of.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, and guess what? We don't hear anything else about it until book 2. In the middle of book 2, all of a sudden, now he describes what flatheads are. You remember what it was?
Knife. It's the knife.
Yes.
What is it?
Edge of the blade? No, edge of the
knife.
knife.
It's the knife itself. The blade
The blade
itself.
The blade itself. We did
The blade
it.
itself. There it is.
yeah,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
Abercrombie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah.
Yeah. He talks about this, and I love that. I had no I'm like, well, what the heck was that? And so I have to fill in the blanks, but I enjoy that,
Mhm.
when I remember the author's and book's name. That's especially.
You remembered Flathead though.
I did.
I mean, that's a
And
creative.
they got us there.
I totally agree with that, and I see it a lot of the time. I really struggle because people think, oh, it's a fantasy book, so it has to have all these gods, right? Is like a very common thing. There's got to be a million different gods for a million different things, and I do this in my book, so I am fully with everyone on that concept. But what I notice when it's done very, very well in books is you can tell that the author has built out the lives, the whole history of all of these gods, but they don't tell you what it is. They will mention throughout the story little cookie crumbs about these gods. So when they mention their names, and you can kind of see what they're about and kind of understand some of their story, because they've taken the time to understand those gods as characters, but they're not just like, okay, well, now this god does all these things and came from here and blah, 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 blah. And it's not like 4 paragraphs of info dump, because it's not actually really relevant to the story. But a lot of the time I see people that will come up with these gods just to have gods, and you can tell that they're just throwing them in there so it feels like more of a world, but they just haven't been that well thought out yet. So I think there's a really good balance with it, but
Yeah.
it's
Awesome.
that's what drives me crazy with info dumping.
Yeah.
Actually,
Well, it almost feels like in this day and age with the internet, you could leave a large chunk of it out and then have like a Wikipedia page where that god's name is a link to another page that says the background stuff, or release a novella.
hey, when in doubt, footnote.
Yeah, there you go.
So I will say I have written, like, whenever I finish a book, I probably have like 3 times as much stuff written as will actually appear in the book. And like, I think that's really important. And I think readers can tell that you know more than you're letting on.
Yeah.
And like, that's important. Like,
Mm-hmm.
writing isn't about how many words you can put on a page. It's about putting the right words on the right page.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to go ahead and give that as my don't as a tangent, as to be like, don't be afraid to completely cut things out. You know them, and that's important for you as the writer, but it may not be important for the reader to know in that given time. And if you have a big expanded universe, you can bring it up at some other point where it is relevant.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Yep. I'm
like
going to
that.
say, don't be afraid to try something new, because I think that a lot of us stick with like our genre, like we're writing fantasy or we're writing this or we're writing romance or we're doing a sci-fi. In being able to mix those genres, like you're saying, Adam, is just being able to mash them together. I think that is so bold because it opens up doors for multiple genres, so multiple people can enjoy your book instead of just kind of one set demographic. And I love that. Just don't be afraid to try it because you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point too. Is like, if you're writing a fantasy, you shouldn't be thinking of it as just a fantasy. Like a fantasy, a lot of times when you're writing it, is really just the setting. So like if you think about The Hobbit, it's a heist. Like,
Yeah.
they're going in to steal stuff. Like
Yep.
that's what it is. It just happens to be in a fantasy world. The plot is not fantasy. Like there's no plot involved in fantasy as a generic thing. So it's like you need to have what is your trope of a plot and combine that in. And that's what I enjoy doing. It's like, okay, I write sci-fi in a fantasy world, or I write mystery novels in a fantasy world. So I think that makes it a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I like it.
That's a good point, especially the bit about the heist. I've seen was it Brandon Sanderson puts he teaches a college class and he puts it up on YouTube, and I watched a couple of them, and one of his classes he was talking about just that, like take the plot you were thinking, but now put it against the backdrop of a heist, or take this format and this format and push them together, and then that will completely make your plot even a lot more creative.
Yeah. Since I don't like prologues, I'm gonna say don't
forget your prologue.
Don't forget your prologue, kids. Don't write your prologue and depend that and think that nope, let me rephrase all of this. I'm horrible. Don't think that your prologue is going to carry your whole story. Like don't make that the big happening, and then I'm reading 250 pages of all right, this is kind of boring because I already know about the magic sword. Yeah, I want to say go with what we were talking about earlier. What's the tone? What is that beep? I'd like to know, what is that beeping noise? I don't know what that noise is, but that's been going on the whole interview. I don't know. I think it's coming from Austin. What is beeping in there?
Oh,
no, something is beeping.
I can't hear it either, actually. I heard a little bit of it earlier, but
okay. But anyway, sorry about that. My second round of the night. Yeah, see? Thank you. I'm so sorry. But yeah, figure out the tone of the book is and throw that. That sounds amazing. To me, the prologue should be the seasoning to your story. And then when we dig into your story, that's got to be the big roast beef, the prime rib, or whatever it is. But yeah, let the prologue be the seasoning, and then we get the entire, all the good stuff in the story, right?
Yeah.
So that's me.
Yeah, I agree. So on that same mark, would you say for the epilogue, even if you have your like you were saying earlier, your villain just kind of suddenly open up his eyes in the epilogue after he's supposedly dead, would you need to know that in order for you to leave like an excellent review, or for you to pick up book 2? Do you need to already know that he opened up his eyes? Like, because that like you could like for that example, you could quickly just like that. That's a good example because you could just go into book 2 and you could say, oh yeah, he's back, and here's how he came back, and you could put him, and you don't need to have read the epilogue. So would you say the same thing about the epilogues where they should be skippable?
I would say, I don't know why. I am always thinking about movies whenever we're talking. So here's what I thought of in Inglourious Bastards. Hans Landa, the villain, is sitting down with, I think her name was Claire, in this restaurant. Now, there's a whole backstory to this, but the important part is like he ordered Danish for both of them, and then she was about to dig in. He's wait for the cream, and that was like a hint. Like I know who you are. I'm not going to do anything, but I tried to kill you before, but I'm not going to kill you now. That's a huge spoiler alert. Sorry about that. But he's like, oh, wait for the cream. So for me, it's like it's better with a cream. Like it's amazing. The story's going to be amazing, but then you're going to have this addition, this whipped cream on top of it to make it. Oh my gosh, wow! It was already good before, but now this is amazing. So that's what
I see.
That's what I try to do with my epilogues. Is like the story's fantastic, and now here's a little extra flavor to give you a nice little kick, and to kind of tie you into the next book in the series. That's what I try to do.
I like that.
Sense?
So it's totally. Because if I like the cream because you're talking about like if we're considering them seasoning, then it should be it's not complete without that particular seasoning.
Yeah,
it's kind of what you're saying. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, I hope that made sense. Because
totally
don't make sense, especially after 9 o'clock.
No, I mean I would say whatever you're doing, as long as you're treating them consistently, then like you're setting up that promise for your reader of like, hey, this is what I'm going to be doing with my epilogues. If you're doing prologues, this is what I'm doing with my prologues. So they get a thing of like, okay, if you're just going to info dump in your prologues, I'm going to skip it. If your epilogue is just every time you telling me, oh, the bad guy's not really dead, I'm going to skip it. But it's like if you're like, or maybe I want to see it. Maybe I want to see how did he survive. But like that way the reader knows this is what I need to expect when I'm reading, Austin's book or Holly's book or Bob's book. Or like whenever they read ours, they want to know, hey, this is what I can expect.
Yeah. The it kind of reminds me of like psychological thrillers. A lot of them end with everything ends in the last scene, but then in the epilogue they just kind of tie the whole story up. And if you know to expect that, then you can make the decision whether or not you want to stay on.
Yeah. Well, all right, Adam. This is fantastic. Yeah, I like this. You turned the tables on us. You asked us questions, so we weren't ready. But I love that.
I was curious.
Very much. Yeah, thank you very much for being on here. How else? Not how else. How can our listeners find you?
Yeah. So the two, or I should say the three social medias that I'm on are, so there's Instagram and Threads are the two, same username, Adam W. Schmitz. So that's SCHMITZ. And then on X/Twitter, it's Schmitz Author. So SCHMITZ Author. Okay. And then on all those platforms, the link to get my series on Amazon is up near my bio.
Okay, and the name of your books?
So the series is The Archives of Edgar Brave. The first book is Alistair. The second is Spectres.
Okay. Edgar Brave is an amazing name. I love that. That's a protection.
Thank you. Yeah, this is actually a story I've been thinking about since I was a little kid, and I finished a video game, and I just kept on wanting to play it, but I couldn't find another video game like it, so I invented my own, and so Edgar Brave was the character name back when I was 12.
Awesome.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Right on. I love that story. All right. Well, it was lovely having you. I'm sure we'll have you on again when you introduce maybe book 3.
Perfect. I'd love to be back.
Yeah. All right, folks. So don't forget to subscribe to our channels at the links below so you don't miss any of the Reg Realm content. We always love to hear from our listeners. So if you have a question or topic you want us to dive into, please get in touch. Until then, see you later. Happy writing.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.